But what I want to do today is to offer you 3 very brief ways. And again, when we talk about these responses, these are not meant to be gotcha responses. If I just say this, you're stuck, I stumped you. No, that's not what we're doing. I think sometimes our responses can help us start to think about the nature of the objection to begin with. Sometimes the best responses are the ones that get you thinking. And that's what we're trying to do with these quick shot responses. Today's response is to the objection that if God exists, he wouldn't be so hidden. Why would he be so hidden? I mean, it sure looks like he doesn't exist. Isn't that a better inference than he's just hiding from us? So I want to be able to respond to that. We've got 3 responses in 3 segments. Let's do the first one right now. I'll put it on the screen so you can read along. I think when we read along, it helps us to kind of ingrain this in our own mind. So here's the first way I might respond to this objection. Here we go. Well, I get it. The objection is that he appears to be hidden, and I can't help but agree with that. But have you considered the notion that God might appear hidden for a reason? Let me give you an example. Okay. Even you and I, as mere humans, we understand the nature of true love in the sense that we know that it cannot be forced. You know, you cannot coerce true love. We love our kids and we want them to love us back, but if we force them to love us, if somehow that was even possible, I'm not even sure how you would do that, but I suppose you could deny them privileges, you could threaten them in some way. But if you even tried to force them to love us, you know that would not be true love. It would just be basically coercion. It would be a disingenuous, coerced response. And you want more than that from your kids. You want them to truly love you. We'll look in a similar way. When we give our kids direction, and then we ask them to accept the guidance, right, as a reflection of their love for us, how many times, if you're a parent, have you done that? You're going to have to, if you're like me, and I've done this a number of times, at some point you have to step away and give them the freedom to respond, or actually the freedom to rebel. I mean, look, if I could be in my kids' presence constantly, I bet you they would do everything I tell them to do because they'd be afraid not to because I'm constantly in their presence. You know, if we are ever present, then your kids just, they respond, but not because they love you. It's because you're standing there, because they know you are present, and they probably fear your negative reaction if they don't obey, if they do something they shouldn't do, especially when our kids are young, right? Well, have you ever considered the fact that God may remain hidden, at least to some degree? I'm not saying this is the entire answer, but at least this is part of the answer. He's going to remain hidden to allow us the freedom to respond, but to respond from a position of love rather than a position of fear. In other words, to respond genuinely and not to respond because we've been coerced by his presence. I think that is part of the answer. I've said it before in other episodes. There's a danger in thinking that I can throw out a response and there's the silver bullet response. There is no such thing. The complexity of the nature of God requires us to have complex answers. But let's face it, those kinds of cumulative answers that are more nuanced are going to take time to unpack. That's why I'm hoping that these little conversation starters you have here, that's why we always include a question in our quick shots, because we're hoping to help you get started in conversations, knowing that if I give you 2 or 3 ways to answer this, you might have to use, maybe one's enough. Maybe somebody will look at that in their own life as a parent and say, well, okay, that makes sense. I hope that's the case. But it may not be the case. In which and if that's the situation you're in, you're going to want to offer a more robust, nuanced, cumulative kind of response, and that's why I give you 2 or 3 responses in quick shots. Sometimes on the social media, when I see that somebody has asked a question of me on Twitter or Facebook, and they'll say, you know, why is God so hidden? Before I can even answer, another believer will hop on and answer the question before I can. And often what happens is that other believers will hop on and say, well, he's not hidden. God's not hidden. It's clear that God's present, and we see this also in Scripture in Romans 1, right? That no one has an excuse because the evidence for God is seen in the creation. and so that no one has an excuse to deny the Creator. So I get that, but often you'll see people will jump in right away, and for them, maybe in their lives, they see God in places that some of us don't. Or they see God in, they don't think this is a big issue, because for them, it's not a big issue. For them, it's like, hey, God doesn't even appear to be hidden. Well, why is it that some of us as believers can live our whole life and feel like God is hidden, and some of us can live our whole life and feel like He's at every single corner? Now, I'll be honest with you, I have been suspicious in the past of people who seem like they are hearing God's voice consistently. They see His handiwork in the lives of their kids. I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? What am I missing here? Maybe I'm not the kind of Christian I ought to be. I mean, how many times have you felt that way because you've known somebody who seems to not even consider this to be a valuable objection? Well, what I want to do in the next two responses to this objection is kind of leverage and at least help people to walk toward the idea that God may not be as hidden as you think He is. So the second response now, but the first response in these kinds of categories, I'm going to make right now. I'll put it on the screen so you can see it, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So if you're saying that you think that if God exists, why is He so hidden? One way to respond to that might simply be this. Okay, have you actually been looking for evidence for God's existence? And if so, can you just tell me where you've been looking? The evidence actually abounds if we're sensitive to it. I'm talking about just the evidence now for God's existence. For example, the best explanation for the information that we find in DNA, and remember the genetic code is information, and the best explanation for information is always intelligence. We have no example, as a matter of fact, of anything other than intelligence being able to account for information. So we've got information in DNA. That's good evidence. The best explanation, for example, for the beginning of the universe is something that is not made up of the stuff of the universe. In other words, if the universe begins and all space, time, and matter comes into existence, we need an all-powerful, non-spatial, non-material, non-temporal cause to explain the existence of the universe. That starts to sound a lot like God, doesn't it? The best explanation also for transcendent, objective moral laws and moral obligations, that's also the existence of something that looks a lot like God. You're going to need a transcendent, objective, and personal moral law giver. And the evidence of God's existence, I think it's available, right? That God's existence is the best inference from the evidence, even though God can't be physically seen. It's kind of like when we work a suspect, right? In the sense that that suspect's not at the crime scene anymore, but we've got a lot of evidence that points to who that suspect might be. So my question is, have you been looking in these areas of science, areas of cosmology, of the study of mind and free agency and moral truths, these areas that are, I think, are full of evidence for God? Or have you really attributed all those aspects of our universe, all those aspects of reality to something other than God? Now, in this response, what we're trying to do is to focus more on the evidence for God, not his daily activity, but this idea that the evidence for God is not hidden. That's just one step of it. The evidence for God is not hidden. Now, this is an approach where we're not talking about the activity, the daily activity that might point to God. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about here is, if we're saying that God is hidden, well, the evidence for God is not hidden. And we can demonstrate that. I wrote an entire book about this called God's Crime Scene. And that book looks at 8 pieces of evidence in the universe that really point to the existence of God, that really can only be explained well if there is a divine being outside of space, time, and matter. And those evidences are available to any one of us. As a matter of fact, those are the evidences that I looked at when I first said, okay, I need to really stop and ask the question, does God exist? Because if God does not exist, Christianity is not true. And so that's a foundational claim first. There's a God described accurately on the pages of Scripture. Well, if there's no God, you can't describe Him accurately. So I needed to know. And that's what I looked at. And I think that stuff's not hidden. That stuff is available to us. The only question is, we sometimes will say, well, I don't want to attribute that. Okay, there's information in DNA, but I would rather believe that that somehow developed through just physical processes of space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, even though we have no example ever of that occurring. But I would rather it be that. And so it's a matter of us deciding, are we simply attributing the things that we should have seen clearly as evidence for God? Are we just doing our best to take God out of it and find a way to explain those without God? It might just be that God's not quite as hidden as you think He is. At least the evidence for God is not quite as hidden as you think it is. But that only answers part of that question, because this simply talks about the evidence for God, that's not hidden. I think a lot of people are pushing back because they feel like, well, why isn't God active? Why isn't God involved in my life? Why is God not the evidence for God being hidden? Why is His activity? Because, deism argues that God begins all of this, but has no interaction after creating it. So there would be evidence for God's existence in deism, but you would see nothing that would give you any inclination He cares about you today. Okay, this response, this quick shot is a little bit shorter than the other two, and the idea here is that it'll help you, hopefully, to begin thinking. Again, we said it so many times. These responses are conversation starters, not conversation enders. So let's go ahead to the third way to respond to this. Remember that we've talked about how, well, the evidence for God is not as hidden as you might think. But now let's talk about the activity of God. Here is a response. I'll put it on the screen. In responding to this idea that if God exists, He wouldn't be so hidden, well, okay. Sometimes I think we miss the activity of God because we just aren't open to seeing it. I've been that way. I've certainly been that way as an atheist, and I wasn't a Christian until I was 35, but I've even been that way as a Christian. How many times has something incredibly unlikely occurred, right? And we are not going to say, well, that God was involved in that. Instead, we just attribute it to chance. Happy accident. Oh, he was lucky. These are cultural expressions that if you weren't a Christian, you might find yourself using, right? Because you weren't raised with the sense, or you don't have eyes that are sensitive to the work of God in your life. How many miraculous cures, for example, occur, and then we just say, oh yeah, he wasn't really cured miraculously, he was probably just misdiagnosed. How many unimaginable near accidents or close calls do we just chalk up as, well, he was lucky? See, I think God often shows Himself to us in supernatural ways, but we simply fail, or maybe even willfully refuse, to see it that way. Are you willing to set aside, if just for a second, your bias against supernatural explanations, right? Because if you could do that, if you could just set aside your bias, your presuppositions against God's activity, if you could just do that long enough, you would see a bunch of stuff that I think could very reasonably be attributed to the hand of God. And these events that you used to attribute to chance, or to luck, or to good fortune. Can you see how that might be true? Can you see how that might be available to you, how that might make sense? Here, what we're trying to do, and I sure have experienced this, and it's my, if you've been a Christian for very long, you know that your walk has kind of got hills and valleys, right? There are peaks and valleys. And there have been times when I have not been as sensitive to God's interaction, even to His voice that's being offered to me either through the pages of Scripture or through the advice of friends. There have been times when I've just taken something and pridefully thought, well, I earned that, I did that, I was in control of that, I'm the one who made that happen. When in fact, if I was more sensitive to, look, if you got good evidence and good reason to believe that God exists, and I think we have good reason to believe that He has developed a moral code for us and obligations that Billy describe Him as a personal, interactive God who is concerned about His creation, who is even responsible for the heat that we retain in our bodies for every breath we take. That kind of God who's that involved, if you've got good reason, good evidence that kind of God exists, then why wouldn't you start to open yourself up to the possibility, even reasonable inference, that the stuff you've been attributing to luck and to chance might actually be attributable to a divine being who is interacting, who is responsible for such things. So I think that my skepticism, even as a believer and as a detective, is that I'm always trying to, I believe that God does two things. God's not in control of every single, if I drop a pen, he's not in control. He certainly has the ability to control it, but I don't know that he has decided the pen will fall one way rather than the other. I think he has also created a universe in which the laws that are a reflection of his character have control, have an impact on how physical processes interact. So is that what it is? Is it that we're in a universe in which God's laws are responsible for this, or has God intervened? How do you know where the difference is? That is always the challenge for us as believers. But sometimes I refuse to see God's intervention because I'm just not willing to see it. And that's a lot of it. I mean, I think that the world is full of things we would say are crazy lucky. We can all point to those kinds of things. There are many examples of people who were cured unexplainably, who had amazing things. And we have to decide those thousands of things that will happen this month that we would chalk up typically to misdiagnosis, just lucky, boy, the chemicals must have really worked there to cure it. All these things that we would say, that even doctors will say, I can't explain it. Well, we've got a decision to make. Okay, it's not explainable because it's just dumb luck and you can't explain dumb luck, or is it unexplainable because it's from the hand of God? That's a decision we have to make when we argue that God is hidden. It might just be that we are hiding from God. Hope this helps you to kind of navigate that question, at least as you interact with your friends. All right, we're back here answering another objection to Christianity next week at Cold Case Christianity.